Welcome to another viewer scenario video. In September I reached 2000 subscribers and I started a viewer scenario contest. Viewers could write their own scenarios and I would turn them into a video. Since then, my personal life has gotten quite a bit busier, and I haven't been able to complete all of them. I still have a whopping 10 more scenarios left to cover. I used to only do 2 a video, but I simply don't have the time to make 5 more full-length videos on the side. So instead, we will have 2 final videos capping off the viewer scenario contest, severely cutting down on the size of each scenario. This one will feature What If the Soviets Won the Cold War by Comrade Serov on Discord. The reason why it gets its own video instead of being joined with the others is just the sheer effort put in by Serov. Before I started editing the scenario, it was 92 pages full of content. I couldn't just cut that down to a 5-minute scenario. For anyone interested in the full scenario, it's down in the description below, and after next week's video, you will be able to vote on your favorite viewer scenario on the Possible History Discord, link also in the description. With all that said, let's dive in. So, what if the Soviets won the Cold War? Well, it couldn't. Not in the condition it was in post-World War II, with the country in ruin and a devastated Eastern Bloc to be fed and reconstructed. Its economy unbalanced, Stalin leading the nation into stagnation with no hope of reform within the nation, while there was infighting within the communist bloc and resources were being distributed poorly. Any change after 1945 would simply not be enough to save the USSR. To have a realistic scenario where the Soviets win the Cold War, we need to go back to the very founding of the Union. The Union was birthed after great territorial losses, after which millions more died in the devastating Civil War. Reconstruction was difficult, and all the while it was surrounded by hostile powers ready to end the young nation, something which almost happened in our timeline. So for this scenario, we are starting all the way back in 1917. In October of 1917, the Russian Revolution took place. The provisional government was overthrown and replaced with an all-Russian Congress of Soviets. Lenin took charge of the new government, and it was declared that the Bolsheviks would provide peace, land, and bread to the suffering nation. An assembly was established to adopt the constitution, and after the first election, Lenin's party was the largest, solidifying his position within the young nation. Then in December, negotiations began in Brest-Litovsk on a separate peace between Russia and the Central Powers. The negotiations reached an impasse when Trotsky, the leader of the Soviet delegation, decided on a strategy of no war, no peace. What did this mean? It meant that the Soviets would delay signing a peace deal while not fighting back against the Germans anymore. This was obviously a dumb idea, and it failed in our own timeline. In this alternate timeline, Lenin himself travels to Brest to sign the peace deal himself. This doesn't mean that Russia gets let off the hook. The Soviets would lose Poland, Moldova, and the Baltics. Furthermore, the Soviets had to promise not to interfere in German affairs, including not supporting the Finnish communists. Germany would also gain economic concessions, with the Soviets promising to send Germany Ukrainian grain and exempting the Germans from Soviet nationalization efforts. But soon after the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the White forces would start organizing against the Bolsheviks, with support from all over the world. Despite this foreign support, however, the White movement was disorganized and demoralized, and it was unclear on what their goals even were or how to progress and cooperate. In this alternate timeline, the Soviets are swift to reclaim the Southern Front by executing the White commander there, who was let go in our timeline and continued to cause issues for the Soviets. This would cause a quicker collapse of the Southern Front, allowing the Bolsheviks to focus on the main war in Siberia. In our own timeline, the Soviets attempted to disarm the Czechoslovak region, which led to the Czechoslovak Legion seizing the Trans-Siberian Railway, giving the Whites control over much of Siberia and Central Asia through this crucial piece of infrastructure. This military disaster, however, can easily be prevented. Instead of attempting to disarm the Czechoslovak Legion, the Bolsheviks helped them get home safely, removing them from the civil war altogether. Not controlling the Trans-Siberian Railway is disastrous for the White movement, as it leaves the Whites divided and unable to communicate or form an effective counter-government. From this point, the Soviets simply mop up the individual White Army cells, despite the newly independent Poland joining in on the conflict. Poland would have many initial successes, joining up with Ukrainian and Belarusian White Army elements. But as soon as the Bolsheviks end most of their internal fronts, they can start to prepare for a counteroffensive. Soon after, the Soviets march into Poland and the Baltics, splitting the Baltics in two while marching to Warsaw. The Soviets still failed to take Warsaw though, and they are now being pushed back again in the north. But the southern group had a breakthrough, soon reaching all the way to Krakow. The Poles couldn't hope to defend the entire front line and both major cities, and so they sued for peace. The border was moved west, and following a quick skirmish with the Finns, the civil war was now decisively over with a Bolshevik victory. The Bolsheviks then looked down to the Caucasus, where Georgian and Armenian forces are still fighting for independence from both Russia and the Turks. The Soviets would quickly strike deep into Armenia, forcing the distracted Turks to accept the new border in exchange for military aid. This concludes the darkest chapter in Russian history. With their swift victory, the nation is more intact than in our timeline, millions of lives aren't lost, and the new Soviet Union is larger and more capable of reconstructing itself. Following the end of the Civil War, the Union is by no means in a healthy state. Lenin is crippled after getting shot, but his new economic policy of limited capitalism is maintained. Slowly but steadily, the Union starts to recover from the previous decade of conflict. But soon after, Lenin passes away and a successor has to be found. But in this alternate timeline, the answer is clear. Following the fiasco at Brest-Litovsk, Trotsky is discredited and removed from grace. This means that there is practically no one that can oppose the rise of Stalin into office. Without a clear rival in Trotsky, Stalin feels much more secure in his position, reducing Stalin's paranoia and purges, as there is no prominent anti-Stalin figure to rally behind. From 1925 to 1930, Stalin would embark on harsh collectivization and breakneck industrialization programs. But with the Civil War over quicker, these programs begin sooner, and the Soviets have a much stronger starting point from which to start these programs. And then, Stalin would abolish the Soviet Union. In its place, he would found the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. What is the difference? In our timeline, the Soviet Union was a collective of republics, all with autonomy and a local sense of nationality. In this alternate timeline, there is only one Soviet republic, Russia, and all the others are simply absorbed into it. Why does this matter? Because it gives Stalin more authority to rule the Union from Moscow, instead of having to balance the republics against each other, easing the task of governing. But not all is well for Russia. There are still gulags, collectivization, famines, harsh living conditions, and more. But the industrialization efforts are massively successful, even more so than in our own timeline. Additionally, we will remove the assassination of Sergei Kirov, a big trigger for Stalin's purges of our timeline. Combine this with the lack of Trotsky, and the scale of Stalin's purges would be incomparable. During the early stages of the Chinese Civil War, Stalin had a difficult decision to make. Chiang Kai-shek was in control of most of China, but could he be trusted not to betray the communists? No, Stalin decides, ending the uneasy alliance between the Kuomintang and the Chinese communists. This causes the civil war to resume, with the communists getting full backing from the Soviets, making steady gains and solidifying a power base in the east. When the Japanese invade Manchuria, negotiations between the Chinese factions reopen, but the communists are now in a much stronger position. Meanwhile in Europe, the usual happens. Funny Moustache Man takes charge of Germany, Italy invades Ethiopia, and Spain has a civil war. This civil war still ends in a Republican defeat, but the Soviets do ensure that they send more officers and advisors to gain experience in the conflict. War in Europe is now certainly coming, and the pieces are moving into position. Germany is expanding, Italy still dreams of reclaiming the Roman Empire, and Japan still invades China. But the Soviets are in a much stronger position. The purges are avoided, and the Russian military is years ahead of our own timeline, being better trained, led, and equipped. Stalin would first attempt to build an anti-German coalition with the West, but when that fails, he would still sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Germans, seeking to avoid war for as long as possible as the nation strengthens itself. This alternate Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact would see Poland roughly divided as it was before World War I, with the Soviets also getting a free hand in Finland. Behind the border agreements, the Soviets would provide resources and the Germans would provide technology. These terms are less good for Germany than the ones of our timeline, but Germany still needs to secure their eastern borders and needs to secure Soviet resources before starting their war with the West. So, as Germany invades Poland and combats the Allies, the Russians attack Finland. The Finnish defense is desperate, but slowly but steadily, the Finns get pushed back. Without any outside help, the Finns simply cannot win against a stronger Soviet Union. So in 1941, Finland is absorbed into Russia. But then suddenly, the Germans cross into Russia. The two giants are now at war and the Great Patriotic War has begun. Germany still has the initial advantage and pushes deep into Russia, but the stronger Russians would regroup and halt the offensive much sooner. Germany fails in pretty much all of its initial objectives. Moscow, Leningrad and the Caucasus are all still far out of reach. Meanwhile, the Germans take more losses than in our timeline, while the Russians take less, and the German chances of victory are already looking rough as winter sets in. Meanwhile, the Soviets start their massive mobilization efforts and prepare their own counteroffensives. The Red Army starts to encircle the German center, encircling smaller and smaller groups while working on a larger pincer maneuver. The maneuver turns out to be a great success and the Germans are thrown back. But the Germans try again, attempting to cripple the Soviet military by denying them the Caucasus oil fields. For now though, Germany has to settle for trying to capture Crimea. Crucially though, they fail to capture Sevastopol, leaving the Germans in a very dangerous position. After a devastating Soviet counteroffensive, 500,000 Germans get encircled in southern Ukraine. The rest of the war would see steady Soviet progress through Ukraine and Belarus, while the Allies launch Operation Torch, mostly throwing the Axis out of Africa. Crucially though, Rommel abandons Africa much sooner, preserving much of his strength. The Soviets are preparing to advance into Europe as the Allies plan an offensive into Italy. Soon, the Soviets enter Romania, causing panic among Germany's allies as hope for victory dwindles. Meanwhile, the Allies invade Sicily, but thanks to Rommel, the battle for Sicily alone takes months. The Soviets continue to strike into the underdefended Balkans, reaching down to Greece. The Allies struggle to advance further into Italy as the Soviets enter Budapest, Königsberg and Warsaw. The Allies now fear a Soviet Europe, and they start to rush preparations for an invasion of France. Meanwhile in the Pacific, the Japanese still strike Pearl Harbor, but they ensure to not just destroy the ships, but the fuel depots and docks as well, weakening the US ability to rebuild. The Japanese then move quickly to occupy the Philippines, but in this timeline, MacArthur himself is a casualty in this invasion, removing a top American commander in the Pacific theater. The Japanese then continue their success by managing to sink 2 American carriers while occupying much of Southeast Asia. Capitalizing on their window of naval superiority, Japan also takes the Midway Islands, securing the Western Pacific for the foreseeable future. Within just 6 months of war, the Japanese have sunk nearly the entire Pacific fleet and captured most of Asia. Do these early victories ensure a Japanese victory? Not even close. Japan cannot reasonably continue their successes, while the US can slowly rebuild and prepare for a counterattack. But what has changed is American priorities. The Japanese are now a much more pressing threat, meaning America has to focus less on Europe while advancing slower in Asia. In 1944, the Allies throw all they have at the French coast as Churchill presses them not to wait out the storms. A terrible mistake. The storm ruined the air and naval support for the invasion, and any Allied soldier that did reach the shore was simply wiped out by the Germans. Luckily for the Allies, their southern invasion was a success, making it the only hope for the Allies to get a spearhead into Europe. As a result of D-Day failing, Eisenhower resigns in disgrace. Slowly but steadily, the Allies close in on Germany. Within months, the Soviets capture Berlin as the Allies capture Paris and Rome. The German Empire collapses soon after, and the Soviets rush to secure everything east of the Rhine. The Soviets are now in a position to claim hegemony over Europe, but they are not yet done, as the Soviets then launch an invasion of Japanese-controlled territories in Asia, capturing all of Korea and northern China before the Japanese surrender. Following the war, Allied-Soviet relations would plummet as Soviet influence spreads across the European continent. But soon after, the Chinese Civil War resumes. In the meantime, Stalin has carefully influenced the Chinese Communist Party to ensure that Mao doesn't get into power, but instead the Soviet-aligned Wang Ming does. Following the better position of the Communist Party, they win the Civil War even faster than in our own timeline. The Communists take care to invade Taiwan early on, meaning that the nationalists have nowhere to run. Following the Civil War, there is only one Communist China. Seeing the global disaster for the capitalist bloc, the US would quickly solidify their sphere with an alternate NATO. But soon another disaster struck, as Communists won the Italian elections. This would turn Italy into this timeline's Yugoslavia. Communist, but not fully Soviet aligned. Without Stalin's paranoia, he would survive for longer, since there would be more doctors available and he had less stress from the war going poorly. Stalin's leadership would continue to rule the nation until the late 50s, about half a decade longer than in our own timeline. Towards the end of his rule in our timeline, Stalin became fascinated with the idea of developing a scientific ideology of governance. He wanted to ensure that the Soviet population and civil servants had a good grasp of philosophy, history, law, and economics. Whatever your field was, you needed to have a good scientific understanding of it. In our timeline, before Stalin could achieve this, he had a bad case of dying. But in this alternate timeline, he would push through these reforms. Stalin would then invest in massive infrastructure projects which were cancelled in our own timeline. The Transpolar Railway in the north of the nation was very costly, but it allowed the north of Russia to develop. Stalin would also invest in a tunnel to Sakhalin. This would allow the Soviets to more easily supply the militarily significant island, but it would also allow Sakhalin to integrate more readily in the Soviet economy. Stalin also had plans to create a dollar-free international trade zone. A proposal spanning the Soviet bloc, Latin America, Asia and Africa. Stalin sought cooperation in economy and science across the Third World, and with Stalin's personal interest in international trade, the Soviets could have attempted to compete for the position of economic superpower instead of conceding this position to the US. Stalin also had ambitious long-term plans to improve the lands of the Union by planting forests and irrigation systems across the Union. This system was massively successful, but it was downscaled during Khrushchev's era. We will not have this happen in this timeline, improving the Soviet agricultural yields. Stalin also wanted to invest heavily in Central Asia by building the Turkmen Canal. This project would see canals, power stations and dams being constructed across Central Asia, opening up the region for future development. In our timeline, this was cancelled, but Stalin would see it through, improving the future potential of Central Asia. Then finally, Stalin wanted to develop the domestic market through worker cooperatives, adding a limited free market system within the communist plant system. This was massively successful, giving the Soviet economy some more flexibility outside of the rough production targets of the bureaucrats. But then, from old age, illness and the stress of ruling such a large nation for 3 long decades, Stalin would die. He leaves behind a strong USSR, a nuclear superpower ready to compete with the Americans for global power projection. But that's domestic policy. What is happening on the world stage? A revolution would engulf Iran in 1953, which failed in our timeline since Stalin's death distracted the Soviets from interfering. With Stalin still firmly in charge, he would intervene and ensure a communist Iran. As decolonization accelerates in Asia, Vietnam is split between North and South Vietnam. Before long, the two states would engage in conflict, while the Chinese, under close eyes from the Soviets, don't push for border conflicts with India, instead seeking closer ties with India, binding large parts of Asia close to the Soviets. Meanwhile, Wang Ming would industrialize China in much the same way that the Soviets did decades ago, with Soviet investments to help. This would cause massive human suffering, but also start China down the road to industrialization decades earlier than in our own timeline. So, who would succeed Stalin? The most likely candidate would be Malenkov. Malenkov sought to develop the Soviet civilian industries, reduce the party bureaucracy, and advocated for peaceful coexistence with the West. Apart from that, Malenkov would largely continue the course set by Stalin, just with a softer hand. Malenkov would also found an organization binding communist Europe together in an EU-like organization. This also avoids Khrushchev, who rushed liberalization, causing discontent at home and in other communist states, while increasing corruption within the party and destroying the limited free market as set up by Stalin. So now we enter the 60s, where the Cold War really starts to get going. With the decolonization of Africa, the board is now set for a global power struggle. A key nation to control is the Congo, one of the richest nations in terms of resources, and so the Soviets would invest heavily in the civil war there, ensuring a communist Congo emerges. In Soviet-controlled Europe, things are mostly similar to our own timeline, apart from Germany. With Germany being much bigger, it's also a much bigger player within the Eastern Bloc, and the Soviets and Germany together are the cornerstones of Europe. Malenkov's Eastern European Union would also ensure Europe is much closer integrated, with access to both the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Oceans. In general, the Soviet bloc is tighter integrated and economically stronger. So what is America doing during this time? For the most part, the same as in our timeline. With communism spreading fast in Eurasia, the US gets a red scare and it intervenes in Vietnam and gets bogged down, much like in our own timeline. But then, Kennedy would survive assassination. This would mean that there is no martyr for the Civil Rights Act, and with active Soviet backing to anti-establishment groups in the US, the Republicans see the act as federal overreach, heavily opposing it. Civil instability in the US begins to ferment. Meanwhile, the space race goes much the same way as in our own timeline, apart from the finale. With the Soviets capturing Werner von Braun, they are much ahead in rocketry technology, reaching the moon first, further demoralizing the US. Under Malenkov, the Union is doing better, but the Soviet economy still has some fundamental flaws. There are two proposals to solve this: decentralization or automation. In our timeline, the Soviets attempted decentralization, which put more money in the hands of the workers and the companies instead of the state, which was quite unpopular with the state apparatus. The richer citizens also began to demand more goods, causing more shortages and inflation in the short term, so these reforms were turned back. In this alternate timeline, Malenkov would push for automation. Unifying the Union's computing systems into one single network would greatly increase the efficiency and simplicity of the planning process for the central government. The implementation and expansion of this system would be slow initially, but steadily it would ease the issues of the Soviet system by improving Union-wide communication. Then, during the 1970s, Malenkov would resign, making Alexander Shelepin the leader of the Union. Shelepin would further allow limited private industry while reforming the KGB into an anti-corruption institution. Shelepin would try to spread communism further while continuing to reform the Union. Throughout it all, the cruel Vietnam War was still being waged. The Americans sent even more soldiers to the nation, but they still feared Chinese retaliation, so they never directly invade the north. The US would invest heavily in the war, but the war becomes increasingly unpopular, leading to riots at home. Especially as Laos and Cambodia fall to communist revolution, it becomes clear that Vietnam simply cannot be held. A new revolution would start in Thailand as well, causing the US to increase their efforts even more in Southeast Asia, only to eventually be forced to retreat from the region altogether. And even in the Americas itself, things are going poorly. Despite CIA efforts, Cuba, Peru and Chile have turned communist, striking fear into the US that communism could entrench in their very own backyard. In the Union, Shelepin would work further to integrate all of Eurasia, pushing a joint currency from Germany to Korea, and seeking to expand his reforms to other communist states. During the 70s, an energy crisis would start to rock the Western world as the Arab-Israeli conflict causes the Arab states to stop supplying oil to Europe and the US. This would lead to the US stepping up to supply oil to Europe, giving them great economic leverage over the European states. Revolutions in Portuguese Mozambique and Angola turn both into Soviet allies, while a joint Indian-Soviet effort splits Bangladesh off from Pakistan as a Soviet ally. While the US, on its own, is still more powerful than the Russians, in terms of power projection, the Soviets are increasingly winning the Cold War. This causes the US to elect Ronald Reagan, who promises to fix the failing economy via Reaganomics. But before he can introduce any reforms, he gets assassinated, leading to Bush being sworn in as president, with US politics being shocked by the loss of a president. Meanwhile, Stolypin starts to invest in the integrated defense-offense oceanic land-space complex, essentially the Soviet version of the Star Wars project by Reagan of our timeline. If this project is successful, the Soviets would be able to strike down any nuclear weapon before it reaches Soviet soil, essentially causing mutually assured destruction to be gone, and giving the Soviets a free hand to strike the West with nuclear weapons while the West can do nothing in return. This would cause Bush to invest more and more money into the US military, at a time when the economy was stagnating and desperately needed reform, causing the economic situation to only worsen. US diplomacy would reach a low point during the Falklands War. Two US allies, Argentina and Britain, start fighting over some dumb islands. The US, assuming the Falklands aren't a big deal, pressure Britain into giving up the islands. After all, colonialism was over. This would cause a massive rift between the UK and US. Meanwhile, the Soviets, through Angola and Mozambique, would collapse the apartheid South African regime. The Cubans then caused the most tense moment in the entire Cold War. In a surprise move, the Cubans, with Soviet backing, join a revolution in Panama, occupying the Panama Canal. With both sides threatening nuclear war if the other makes a move, the US is forced to concede the canal. The United States of this timeline is much like the Soviet Union of our timeline. Unable to compete militarily, economically, but most importantly, diplomatically with the other great power. The nation is turning more and more paranoid and radical, as the establishment is failing on all fronts. But the most decisive moment in the Cold War would be a coup in Mexico. The Russians managed to collapse the Mexican regime, creating a communist state on the US doorstep. The US simply cannot accept this and invades Mexico. The Americans quickly win the conventional war, but then Mexico turns into a new Vietnam, where every Mexican could be a potential enemy combatant. In the meantime, the Soviets used the opportunity to collapse Venezuela's regime. Shelepin would then step down, being succeeded by Gregory Romanov, who would continue the course of Ottomization, fighting corruption, and increasing Eurasian integration. A leftist French election victory would see France abandon NATO and the institution thereafter largely disbanded. The now isolated West German rump state seeks integration into East Germany, a massive blow to American power projection into Europe and American prestige on the world stage. The 1998 election would see parties other than the Democratic Republicans have success, slowly breaking the two-party system. There would still be a war in Afghanistan, and while the Soviets perform a bit better, it was still a drag for the Russians to win. Therefore, the Russians decide on a radical course of action. They need to knock out Pakistan, the main supporter of the Afghan rebels. The Soviets escalate the Indian-Pakistani conflict and invade themselves from their holdings in Afghanistan. Soon, Pakistan would fall, and without any foreign backing, Afghanistan is pacified as well. Meanwhile, a desperate US reaches international crisis. As a Soviet-backed Iraq conquers Kuwait, the US intervention into Libya fails, Brazil elects a Soviet-friendly Lula, and the American industrial outsourcing causes upheaval among the working class. The Soviets, through their investment in optimized systems, quickly develop something close to the modern internet. The Soviet O-gas system connects the economy both vertically and horizontally. This would cause another upscale in Soviet efficiency and reduction in Soviet corruption. O-gas would soon be expanded beyond just Russia, connecting Eastern Russia and China to the system as well. By the late 90s, the Soviets are undeniably the dominant world power. The ruble is the global reserve currency, and it's even looking likely that the Soviet economy may overtake the American one soon. In 2008, we find the US in a sorry state. Their economy is stagnating, everyone is radicalizing, and the US government is increasingly more authoritarian to keep the nation together. Several small states are in debt, and some wealthier ones are considering seceding the Union to stop having to subsidize the weaker state. Slowly but steadily, the very concept of America is getting hollowed out as ethnic, political, state, and religious lines start to divide the nation. The 2012 election would be the decisive moment for the US. The main choices are a progressive Democrat seeking détente with the Soviets, essentially conceding the global power struggle and focusing on American internal issues, while the other candidate is a hardline Republican seeking to double down on the Mexican intervention and reclaiming American standing in the world. Besides these two candidates, there were dozens of political parties influencing individual elections, although none was large enough to win the presidency. With a terrible 45% voter turnout rate, the Republicans narrowly won. The vote was already controversial thanks to the low turnout, but when reports of voter fraud came in, the nation engulfed in chaos. Soviet-backed actors on the West Coast seized government buildings, right-wing militias armed and organized in the South, and Utah became the first state to officially secede the Union. Texas has, by this point, been considering independence for a long time, as being the front line of a guerrilla war is not a fun position to be in. Texas leaves the Union, and several surrounding states request to be united with the now independent Texas. New England unifies under the socialist visionary Bernie Sanders. Finally, an alt-right regime takes charge of Florida. The Washington government declares martial law and declares that all soldiers have to return to the US immediately. The Second US Civil War has begun. In the confusion, the Soviets quickly seize Alaska and undefended US Pacific bases. But the federal government fails to stabilize the nation. A peacefire would be called in 2014, ending the bloodshed. The collapse of the US was now final and irreversible. The Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic stands as the sole superpower of a new age, bringing in the era of Pax Sovietica. But while the first couple of years are a massive victory for the Soviets, as the Soviets attempt to integrate worldwide communism, cracks were showing in the communist world as well. Konstantin Siomin would be the new leader of Russia. He would champion the concept of a Lisbon-Vladivostok Union, a true union of Soviet socialist republics. But the Soviet system was still very repressive, causing a lot of discontent for the proposal in the more liberal-minded Europe. A few states would support the project, but without the unifying enemy in America, many European states started to carefully move away from Soviet influence. Most crucially, Germany, who practiced a much more syndicalist state-capitalist model with a much more liberal society. Many European states, especially the more moderate and democratic socialist ones, began to align themselves with Germany rather than the Soviets. Similarly, in East Asia, the Chinese were becoming increasingly dominant and independent from the Soviets, and in the Middle East, Arabia and Turkey were starting to use Islam as a way to destabilize the Soviet allies in the region. In Africa, for now, the Soviets were the uncontested hegemon, but it was mostly an endless sinkhole for Soviet resources, while only very few nations managed to develop economies that could function independently from direct Soviet interference. But the Soviets also couldn't afford to stop aiding Africa, as the European and Chinese are increasingly attempting to build their own power bases on the continent. And let's not forget about the former US. While significantly weaker than when it was united, all the successor states still share a common dislike of the Soviet Union. Even the Soviet-backed communist West Coast protested the Soviet seizing of Hawaii and Alaska. In the meantime, as the US stops being a threat, the South American states slowly reform away from communism into more democratic socialism. And even within the Soviet Union, things aren't perfect. The KGB is increasingly dominant over state institutions, while even with computing, the planned economy has many flaws, causing shortages and mistakes across the Union from time to time. Meanwhile, the increasingly prosperous Soviet population is increasingly demanding more and more rights and liberties, and even autonomy for nationalities within Russia. But all of that is a problem for the future Soviet generations. For now, despite its troubles, socialism has won the hearts and minds of Earth, with liberal democracy and capitalism discredited. Pax Sovietica, while fragile, proved to be superior to Pax Americana. And that's it for Serov's viewer scenario. I liked it a lot. It was extremely impressive, especially the amount of detail and effort put into the scenario. I have cut about 2/3 of the content that Serov has provided me, and the scenario still lasts for well over half an hour. It is extremely impressive to what amount of detail this scenario has been worked out by Serov. In this video you only got the Cliff Notes version, but individual dates, names, peoples and battles were described and analyzed. It was extremely impressive and I thank Serov for it. Again, do be sure to check out the description below for the uncut full scenario. But for now, let me know in the comments how you think the scenario develops from here. If you enjoyed the content, consider subscribing for at least one alternate history video every week. To help the video grow, consider leaving a like and a comment. It really helps out against the algorithm. Even just commenting something simple like hi helps the video out massively. Again, thank you all for watching, and a special thanks to these patrons who help me dedicate more time and effort to the channel by supporting me monetarily. To help the channel and get early access to videos whenever I complete them myself, consider supporting me there. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.